Hey there folks, it's Brandon Schaefer here with another lesson video. Hope you guys will enjoy this one. And in front of me here I have a 6x8 canvas panel. Kind of a reoccurring theme here. You're going to see a lot of these in the near future, so stay tuned. My colors and the brushes I used will be posted in the description below, so check that out if you want to know exactly what colors I'm using and the size and kind of brushes that I'm using. I only use about 2 different brushes and maybe a liner brush for details and for signing my name, etc. So very simple. And these are real-time videos, so nothing is sped up here, nothing is really edited, nothing is slowed down. It's the real speed of me painting the painting. So okay, first thing here, I'm using the larger brush that I use, and just using it to sketch on the composition, breaking down the basic shapes, throwing on the foundation, and at this stage nothing's really too permanent. It's just sorting out, planning out the composition and what you're going to paint. And I'm just using a mixture of white with a little bit of blue in it. It's kind of a personal preference. You can use more of a red color if you wish. I just stick with the blues. So just slowly sketching it on here, but you can do it a lot quicker. As you get more confident, you'll start sketching it a lot quicker. You'll start to notice that it doesn't really matter. For the most part, you don't have to be really detailed about it. Just break down the basic shapes and get the structure down. Sketching out some mountains. It's going to be kind of a lake in the foreground, so there's going to be some reflections. Hope you guys will enjoy that. A lot of these near future lesson videos I'm going to be making have a lot of water reflections and water in them. Hopefully these will be really valuable and helpful to you for learning how to paint water, reflections, etc. I'm also going to be using some glazing medium, and that's mostly at the very end of the painting. So check that out. I have another video on glazing medium on my channel page, so check that out. You'll have to search glazing medium. It's made by Golden Acrylics, so Google that if you've never heard of it or never have used it. It's satin acrylic glazing medium, and what it does is it thins out the paint. You use 9/10 glazing medium and 1/10 paint, or something to that effect. Doesn't have to be perfect. The more paint you use, the more powerful the glaze is going to be, and sometimes you don't want it to be very powerful. You want it to be very subtle. And glazing, I'll get into more of that later. I'll make other videos on glazing. I have other videos on glazing, so check those out if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so now I'm laying on the first layers here, which are shadow layers. Some dark green. And if you're not sure how to mix, dark shadow colors, it's very simple. I'm not using any white. I'm using red, blue, and yellow. Every color mixture I say on here is going to be red, blue, and yellow. But it just depends on how much red you're using, how much blue, and how much yellow. Obviously, to mix green, you mix blue and yellow, and then just a little touch of red will neutralize it and darken it, so it'll give you a dark green. So just play around with that, and color mixing is something you really have to learn on your own and really experiment with. You can be taught the color mixtures and the color wheel, but until you actually do it and practice it, you know, it's going to be something that's challenging. But the more you do it, the easier it will come to you, and it becomes very natural. You know, to find these right tones and shadow colors and contrast. So the first stages of the painting here, I'm throwing in the darks, the shadows. You can even use more of a purple color for some of the shadows. Just depends on what painting you're doing. You know, you can follow along with me here. Very basic strokes, just adding some variation. Or you can use these concepts that I'm giving you and apply it to your own painting that you're working on, you know, whatever's in front of you. And I encourage you to do that. You know, maybe you can copy some of mine to begin with if you're a beginner, and just kind of test it out, test the waters out, see how well you're doing, and then kind of venture out on your own. You know, use some photos, go outside and paint what you see, etc. So give that a shot. So now moving on to the mountains that are farther away in the background. And what I do is add white to the shadow mixture to lighten it up and give it more of a neutral tone. And more of a bluer tone as well. Usually things off in the distance, if you want a lot of atmospheric perspective, things are very blue and purple and very neutral. There's not a lot of contrast. So what that means is there's not a lot of dark shadows and there's not a lot of bright highlights. The highlights and the shadows are almost the same level of contrast, the same tone. More contrast is saved for the foreground and for the focal area, focal points. Things closer to you will be darker and the highlights will be brighter. Things farther away with a lot of atmospheric perspective are going to be misty, they're going to be very neutral. Now I'm using a photo reference here, so what I'm doing is analyzing the photo, breaking down the simple shape, breaking down the shadows, and just filling in all those areas, and then I go back and fill in all the highlights and such, and the middle tones. And the first process is just blocking it in. Very simple, basic, nothing too detailed. You know, a lot of just big strokes using a large brush. And the brush size depends on what size your canvas is. If you're using a lot bigger canvas, you know, a larger canvas, then you're going to use a larger brush. It's common sense. And these mountains are farther away. The ones I'm working on now with the purple. And the purple is a red and blue mixture, and then I add in touches of yellow to neutralize it, which makes it more gray. Gives it a grayer tone, so that it's more neutralized. Farther away, things are a lot grayer, purple, blue, etc. And a lot lighter. And also the edges, pay attention to the edges, and that's what I'm working on now, using my finger kind of blending out the edges so that they're not very sharp. And notice a lot of people give me questions about this, that I haven't really done the sky. I do the sky after since there's not much sky, I do the sky after I do the foreground. If the painting was mostly sky and just a little bit of foreground, I would do the sky first. So that's kind of my thought process on that. You key the sky to the ground, so you just do the ground and the foreground and everything first. And also, when I do the sky, I can blend those edges of those mountains and make them a lot softer. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, just don't be afraid to post down below or send me a message. Whatever floats your boat to contact me, whatever's the easiest way for you. You can send me an email as well. There's no problems there. So what I'm doing now, if you don't see me painting, folks, just be patient. I'm mixing up a lot of color. It's unfortunate that I didn't plan out to show you my palette. These were more of time-lapse videos, and I'm just going back and doing lessons. But I'm confident in a lot of you guys that you'll be able to mix up your own colors. So for the sky, it's a very light blue, almost gray tone, but very light blue. You know, it's hard to even see it, but it is a few tones darker than the white canvas. So as you can see, I filled in all the shadow areas, so now I'm moving on to the sky because I want to rectify and solidify those edges of the mountains. And the farther away mountains are going to have softer edges. And things closer to you are going to have sharper edges, things that are more in focus. And that creates a lot of depth. And that's very important with a painting. If all your edges are harsh and straight, you know, and not kind of blurred like I did there, you're going to have a very amateurish looking painting. And there's not going to be a lot of depth. So keep that in mind. It's something very important. As well as contrast. Contrast and values give you all the depth in the painting. So things farther away are a lot lighter. Things closer are a lot darker. Generally that's the, you know, how it is. At least with the shadows. So quite soon here I'm going to be mixing up, you know, more of the midtones and etc. You can see there I'm kind of correcting the background mountains. I kind of felt they dried a little too dark. Acrylics dry a lot darker. So sometimes you have to correct things, and that's all a painting is a number of corrections. Just constant, just always judging your subject, judging every mark you put down. And all things in a painting are relative. So what that means is if you throw down a dark color, it could be the darkest color on the canvas, but then if you later on, if you make a mark that's actually darker than that one, you know, that first dark tone will actually become lighter. So everything's relative, and you want to make sure all these first stages, the initial marks and shadows and such, you want to make sure that these colors are as accurate as possible, because the rest of the painting is based off of these marks, these tones. So keep that in mind, folks. It's very important. Just using my finger there to blend the edges a little bit, soften them up. You want some soft edges for farther away. And that's something I struggle with, is making soft edges with acrylic. You just got to experiment and see what works best for you. Sometimes I have to use my finger like that, or sometimes I use a scumbling technique. Other times I'll use some glazing. It's all very situational and just depends on what you're painting. And just experiment. That's the whole point of it. So now I'm working on the most saturated tone, which isn't the brightest tone. It's the most pure color. And what it is a nice green mixture of phthalo blue, a lot of yellow, and then a little touch of red here and there. As you saw just a second ago, I threw some red on there, which neutralizes the green. It gives it more of an earthy tone, makes it look more realistic. But this is the most pure color. Maybe a little touch of white later on will go there for some highlights. But this is kind of the strongest color, something that will attract your eye. And the rest of the painting is just different degrees of neutrals. You know, nothing in this painting will be more saturated than this tone. Because at the beginning, you kind of want to locate the extremes, or at least take a note of the most neutral color, the most saturated color, the brightest highlight, and the darkest shadow. These are things you want to locate and kind of place down first and be most accurate with those, because those are the most important things. And then everything is in between those two factors. So once you locate the darkest shadow and the brightest highlight, nothing is brighter than that highlight, as nothing is darker than that shadow. So that means everything in the painting is in between those two extremes. And that's what you want to keep in mind. Locating the extremes and then making sure that the rest of the painting is within those two extremes. So now I'm putting on a very neutral green tone. And what this does is it pushes it back. You can see right now that there's a lot more contrast in the foreground with that pure color and the dark shadow. And in the middle, that middle hill that I'm working on right now, it's very neutral. Even though the shadow is a little bit darker, you know, it's lighter than the one in the foreground. And the color is very neutral. So what it does is it pushes it back. It gives it this hazy effect. I encourage you to study nature and study these things. Look at things really far away in the distance. And usually you'll see that there's this blue haze, depending on the light. And that's very important. Light is a very important factor, depending on what time of the day and what kind of light it is. You know, if there's a ton of clouds in the sky blocking out the sun, if it's mostly a cloudy day, the light's going to be very diffused and there won't be many shadows. Everything is very diffused and there's a lot less contrast. But say it's a sunset, very bright sunset, you know, then the light's going to be very orange. And it changes the color of greens, it changes the color of nature. You know, everything is lit up by the sun and the light source. So depending on the color of the light source, depends on the color, you know, determines the color of nature. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so now you can see here the painting is really taking shape. You can see the illusion of distance, and this is what you want to see in your work. A lot of distance, foreground, middle ground, background, sky, etc. Not always, but for the most part, if you're doing a painting of this nature, you want to see things like this. And if you're not seeing distance in your painting, then ask why. If something doesn't look right, then ask why. Why doesn't that look right? Is the shadow too dark? Is the highlight too bright? Is there not enough neutral color? You know, what is it? Try to diagnose your own problems and solve your own problems. Being an artist and a painter it's kind of like being a problem solver. Get used to doing that. Okay, so to recap what we have now. Okay, I'm going to start working on the water here, but to recap really quickly, you know, that pure color is in the foreground with the dark shadow, and then the middle ground is a lot more neutral, and then the background is purple, you know, very neutral, very toned down, very light. So that's how we create this depth and different layers within the painting. Now I'm working on the water here, and I'm adding the shadow to the water, reflections. So I'm using a purple color. Looks like a little bit more blue in it. Kind of a cooler purple. So red and blue, maybe a little bit of yellow to neutralize it. And a little touch of white here and there. As you can see, the first layer of acrylic usually is translucent. It's not very opaque. And this is just the blocking in stage, so don't worry about it too much. Because we'll end up going back over it a little bit later, at least in a few areas. And you don't have to paint so detailed all the time. Just create the illusion of detail. Use suggestion to suggest details. As you can see what I did there, I did some scumbling technique to blend the edge out. You know, I didn't want such a harsh edge, so I blended it out a little bit. But I also need to paint on the sky color, which I'm doing there now for the water and reflections, and that'll also help with the edge. I'll be able to blend the two together since they're both wet. That's what I'm doing right there. You can see they're kind of blending together. Creates a nice soft edge, and that's what you want for the most part. A lot of harsh edges, you know, straight lines and such, those attract the eye. So you only want those where you need them. You know, focal areas, focal points, etc., because those attract the eye. As you can see, I'm getting a little more detailed here. Just trying to make the edge just very subtle. The edge is kind of sharp in the actual mountain, so I'm trying to replicate that in the reflections. There's the whole canvas blocked in. Now I'm moving into the next stage, kind of. And really that's just eventually using a smaller brush, fixing some of the shadow areas, darkening where it needs to be, and then adding highlights, etc. So as you can see here, I have a purple color, and it must have been the wrong color or the wrong tone, so I'm going back and maybe adding some more blue, making it a little darker. You know, you have to correct things. Sometimes when you're mixing it up on your palette, it'll look a lot different when you go throw it on the canvas, because color is very relative. You know, it all depends. So there I'm working on the edge a little bit more, making it look like trees are sticking up or something. Just a little bit of detail, not much though. You'll see here I start painting a lot more slowly because I'm not really blocking in. I'm trying to be precise with my strokes and confident with my strokes. Making sure they're correct, because from here on out you want everything to be correct. So I'm just building the shadow layer of this mountain. And I'll go back over it afterwards with some of the highlights again. And this is kind of the second layer, building on top of what you blocked in. And I'm just making marks here, nothing really detailed. So keep that in mind. It's just paint strokes, brush strokes. I give the illusion of detail, the illusion of reality. Notice all those shadows that I just put on, they're kind of a dark blue color, more of a purple, but very neutral. Very neutral. And what's that mean? It just means mixing complements almost, but using the primary colors to mix these complements. So that blue shadow had maybe some orange mixed in, but orange is just red and yellow, so I used red, blue, and yellow. So now I'm going back with much darker shadow, which pushes those neutral tones that I just made, pushes them a lot farther back. So now that the dark and light contrast comes a lot more forward, these dark tones come forward, creating the illusion of depth. It's very simple, folks. Don't think about it too hard. Just paint what you see. Paint marks that you see. Paint shapes. You know, if you want to paint clouds, don't think about painting clouds. Just paint shapes. Shapes, tone, and color. When you paint those correctly, the clouds will just emerge from the painting. I found that to be the case with reflections as well. You know, I struggled for a few months trying to paint water reflections, and I've come to realize that I just have to paint what I see and what I observe. And then the water reflections just emerge from those shapes and color. It's that simple. So there's some dark shadows, and now you can see a lot of the highlight color went away, and I'll have to add a little bit of that back in after I fix up these shadow areas. And also remember to use different pressure. Sometimes, at least in the blocking in stage, I use a lot of pressure and really scrub the canvas to get into all the fibers and such of the canvas to block it in. But these next stages, and when I'm scumbling like I just did and creating shadows and stuff, I don't use a lot of pressure. I just let the paint, you know, come off of the brush. You know, right there, you know, not really a lot of pressure. It's just these different degrees, and you have to be very sensitive to these things, to how much pressure you're using. And that's something very hard. It's something I can't really teach you through a video. You have to learn on your own and experiment with how much pressure you're using when you apply the paint and use your paintbrush. It's just like anything else. I use both extremes. At the beginning, you know, I'm really scrubbing as hard as I can, moving the canvas around. You know, sometimes the canvas falls off my easel because I'm scrubbing it so hard, and I get so into it I don't pay attention. But then in these other stages, I'm very delicate. You can just see with the brush right there how delicate I'm being and very precise about it. Trying not to disrupt the layers underneath. Keep that in mind, folks. Very important. Alright, folks. Hope you're being patient out there. Hope you're enjoying this video. Trying to make it as best as I can and give a lot of tips here for everyone. And not just on how to create this painting, but how to create your own work. So now I'm moving into adding the midtones and highlights and such, at least for the reflections here. You can see I'm trying to do kind of a mirror image almost, a little bit of the mountain after I added in all the shadow tones. And notice the time change here. You know, I just added on those shadows just a minute ago. But since it wasn't a lot of paint, you know, it probably dried very quickly. And also, if I'm being very delicate in this stage, it's blending with those shadows and I'm getting different variations. And that's what you want. Nature has a ton of variety. So keep that in mind. Now I'm moving on to the saturated tone, the very saturated tone, and the highlights, adding these back in, but also leaving a little bit of shadow where need be. Also adding the highlights to the reflections there, as you can see down below. Take note of the water reflections there. They're almost the same exact tone, which you don't want. But I'll show you here in the end of the video how to create the illusion of water reflections. This is the main stage of it, is throwing on these tones and getting it to reflect and make it look somewhat realistic. But at the end, I'm going to use the glazing medium with a little bit of white. And what that does is give it this misty illusion that light is shining across. And that's what you're looking for with water reflections. A white water line, etc. But I'll point that out as I go along. I just want you guys to know my thought process on that and how I create my water reflections. So now I'm using the saturated green, adding a little bit of white in there though for some highlights. So it's phthalo blue, yellow, white, maybe a little bit of red. Not much red, but a lot of white and yellow for some highlights. And this really kicks it up a notch a little bit. God, I sound like Emerald or something on the cooking show. Kick it up a notch. But give you guys some comedy here. And notice I'm just giving a lot of variation with the grass, making it look realistic. Variation, that's key to realism. Variation in nature. A lot of different tones, a lot of different values, a lot of different shape, sizes, color, etc. Also take note of the composition here and the rule of thirds. Check that out. Okay, adding some highlights on the small trees, kind of using the same color that I just used, maybe a little bit less bright. And not much, just little touches of, see that, little variations gives a lot of different depths, different levels of things coming toward you and how far away they are. So that's very important. Getting close to the end here, maybe about 10 more minutes or so. So hang in there if you made it this far. Because at the end with the water reflections, I mean, that's what really sets this thing off. And I believe I may do a little bit glazing on the mountains too. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I probably didn't though, because I don't think I needed to. But glazing is so versatile, man. It does a lot. You can add blue. You can mix up any kind of color you want. Add some glazing medium to it. You can glaze over some shadows with some blue. Cool down the shadows. You can warm up the shadows. You can warm up areas. Cool down areas. Add white to give depth. There's so much. And I've noticed that adding it to my paintings, it just pushes it up to the next level. So what I did on the foreground right there is a tan color. So what that is, it's red and yellow mostly to create orange. Then you add a little bit of ultramarine blue to neutralize it. because orange and blue are complements on the color wheel, and that's how you create neutrals. And then I added white, so it gives this sandy kind of tone. Just creating a shoreline, some dirt, etc. Nothing too detailed though, just some simple brush strokes with a smaller brush. Really starting to come together now. Okay, so here's the beginning of the glazing medium, and how I do this is I use a very soft brush. Not a bristle brush, a softer brush, fine kind of haired brush, soft haired brush. And I'm using some white. I don't even think I added glazing medium on this part. I think it's just a little, very little touch of white. Maybe some glazing medium. What I'm doing is adding a shoreline there. Or maybe that was tan, maybe there's some brown. No, it's some white. White with some glazing medium. So I wanted to separate the water where the water meets the earth, meets the shore. I wanted to solidify that a little more. So that's what I did there. And you can already see that makes a big difference. Separates the ground from the water. Very important. Excuse me. What I just did there was making sure that the water was completely dry, that that area of the reflections was completely dry. And I don't think it was, so I had to stop the camera and let it sit for about 10 minutes, or for a little, 5 minutes or something, and let it dry. So right here I'm mixing up the glazing medium with some white in it, just white. I didn't use any other color. And I'm going to use that soft-haired brush, and I'm going to go over the water. And you'll see what a huge difference this makes. And after I throw in the glazing medium, you may have to go back to this part of the video to really see the difference, because it's so subtle and it makes such a big difference that you'll probably be surprised. Okay, so here's the beginning. And sometimes you can have too much paint accidentally, but don't panic. Just clean your brush off, add some more glazing medium, less paint, and go back over it. Double checking there. See right there is so much white paint. I kind of panicked for a second. But I go back into the glazing medium, and it spreads it out a little more evenly. And that's what you want. And you want to do this really delicately with a soft brush. So you can see there it's just adding this sheen over the water. Like very crystal clear, not really clear water, but just a nice reflection on this water. So check out the difference already. I mean, that's a huge difference. Rewind the video if you have to really see the difference it makes. But it's a major difference, and it'll make your water reflections look so much more realistic. Because glazing doesn't have to be the last step. For me in this paintings it was, but you can do the glazing, let that dry. It'll usually take a long time to dry, maybe 20-30 minutes depending on how much you put on. Let that dry, and if you need to, you can go back over and add more paint on top of it, and then do another layer of glaze, or whatever the case may be. It's so versatile. It's so versatile. You can do so many different things. It just depends. But check out the difference there for the water reflections. Huge difference. Looks so much more realistic. And what that did, it toned down the water reflections, so now that the actual foreground, the trees and such come forward, And I add a little bit of white glaze on top of the the background mountains there, which just pushes them back a little further, gives a little more depth and distance, some haze to the painting. And I'm using very little right there, just very little. It's so subtle, but it makes a huge difference. Creates a lot more depth, and that's what you want. So that's very important. So there I am, just going crazy with it. And that, my friends, is pretty much a finished painting. Adding a little more touches there. Had to touch it up a little bit. Make some corrections, etc. That's pretty much a finished painting. I'm going to sign it here in a second. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. This is probably one of my favorite paintings I've done so far. This is where I really started to begin to understand the saturation and the neutrals, and thinking about it that way just changed the way I paint tremendously. It improved my work, tenfold. So I encourage you to think about colors that way, the saturation and the neutrals and the contrast, etc., because that's really important. So now I'm using a liner brush with a lot of watered down paint to get it to easily go on. I'm just signing my name. Very simple. That's probably the most detailed part of the painting is my signature. So once again, hope you guys enjoyed this one. Hopefully you learned a lot. That's my main goal, is helping you guys out, hoping you learn a lot, get a lot from these videos, and hopefully your work will improve, and hopefully you can take these concepts and create your own great pieces of artwork. So like and subscribe if you wish to see more of these videos, of these lesson videos, and post your comments down below or questions if you have any. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you guys. Take care of yourself. Peace be with you, my friend.